Hey, welcome to The Explainer. So today we're going to dig into a really fascinating question by looking at a specific case study. What happens when a community with really deep historic roots suddenly has to figure out its place in a nation that's, well, changing faster than ever? Yeah, it really all comes down to this one big question. We're talking about a 150-year-old community steeped in one specific culture that looks up and finds itself in one of the most diverse places on the planet. It's a story about identity, about change, and about the challenge of taking a hard look in the mirror. Okay, before we go any further, let's just make sure we're all on the same page with a couple of key terms. So you've got race, which is about identity based on physical traits, like skin color. And then you have ethnicity, which is about identity based on shared cultural traditions, things like language, religion, and where your family's from. They're definitely related, but they're not the same thing. All right, so to really get the picture here, let's take a look at the demographic landscape of the U.S. This map, for instance, shows where Hispanic and Latino populations are most concentrated. You can see these really dense areas in the Southwest, in Florida, and in other big cities. And then you see this map, which shows a totally different but just as distinct pattern. This time, it's for African American populations, who are most concentrated in the Southeast for reasons that go back centuries. When you look at these maps together, you realize the US isn't some uniform blob. It's this incredible, complex mosaic of different communities. And look, this isn't just about numbers on a chart, right? This growing diversity, it asks a really personal question for every single community, every town, every organization out there. How do we adapt to this? And that's exactly what brings us to our case study. We're going to zoom in on one particular community, the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, or WELS for short, and see how they started wrestling with these big questions of diversity and faith more than 30 years ago. Now, what's wild is that by 1990, the WELS had already been through this huge transformation. It started out as this pretty isolated, mostly German-speaking group, but by then, it had grown into a church with a presence all across the nation. But, and this is a big but, here's a quote from an internal conference paper from back in 1990. It points out that even though they were nationwide, their actual membership was, in their own words, still relatively homogeneous. There was this awareness even then that the people in the pews didn't really reflect the diversity of the country around them. And these big national trends, they weren't just happening out there. They were showing up right on the church's doorstep. You had huge historical movements like the Great Migration, and then later, white flight, which completely changed the makeup of urban neighborhoods. All of a sudden, these long-established churches found themselves in communities that looked nothing like they used to. So, faced with this new reality, something pretty fascinating started to happen from within the community. There was a call for some serious self-reflection. See, the author of that 1990 paper basically said, hey, the first step isn't about new outreach programs. The first step is to look inward with some humility, to recognize that maybe their own culture wasn't perfect and that they actually had something to learn from other people. So what did that mean? Well, the paper actually called out some specific cultural habits they needed to examine. Things like dualism, where you separate your religious life from your everyday life, or individualism, where being self-sufficient is valued maybe a little too much over being in community, or even just a kind of formality that could come across as cold or unwelcoming to outsiders. And this all boils down to the core challenge that the paper laid out, the danger of confusing your culture with your Christianity. The author makes this powerful point that this isn't a new problem. It's one of the oldest mistakes churches have been making for centuries. All right. So that's the setup from 1990. Now let's hit the fast forward button 3 decades and see what a 2021 study of the church's schools tells us. It's time for a reality check. So here we go. This is kind of the moment of truth, right? After 30 years of conversation and massive demographic shifts across the country, what does the data actually tell us? Okay, so the first big takeaway from this 2021 survey, it shows that this is definitely still a journey in progress. Among the schools that replied to the survey, a huge majority, 83%, reported that minority students made up less than a quarter of their student body. But this is where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about preparation. The survey found that almost 70% of the faculty at these schools said they'd had no formal training on how to educate a diverse group of learners. And that might be a big clue as to why even the best intentions can take a long time to turn into real change. And the data tells one story, but this quote from a school leader in that same survey, wow, It really puts a human face on the whole thing. They said the biggest struggle isn't the kids themselves. Kids are kids. The real struggle is connecting with their families, understanding their backgrounds, and building those bridges to share their faith.
So, where do you go from here, right? Well, the 2021 study wasn't just about problems. It was also about solutions. It pulled together recommendations from people inside the community on how to actually navigate this multicultural future. And what they came up with really boils down to 4 clear, actionable steps. It's almost like a roadmap. First, just be aware. Know who actually lives in your neighborhood. Second, prepare your educators with real, ongoing training. Third, be intentional about building a welcoming community. And fourth, live the faith. Focus on loving relationships and service, not just on reciting doctrine.
And you can see the why behind all these practical steps right here. The whole thing is grounded in their faith. The 2021 thesis points to this idea from the Bible of becoming all things to all people. It frames this whole process of adaptation not as a compromise, but as a core part of their Christian mission. So, when you look at that call for reflection back in 1990, and then you put it right next to the data from 2021, one thing becomes crystal clear. This isn't a story that's over. It's a snapshot of a very real, very complex, and very human conversation that's still happening. And that really leaves all of us with a huge question, one that goes way beyond this one community. For any of us, in any organization with deep roots, how do you honor the traditions that make you who you are, while at the same time genuinely and humbly embracing the change that's going to define your future?